The paradox of viruses. Are they alive? What is life? We don't even know the meaning of the word life, let alone the meaning of life. Since Aristotle tried to define it thousands of years ago in ancient Greece, hundreds of definitions have been proposed for when something is a life form rather than merely life-like. Most definitions tend to describe life with a list of features about what it has and what it does, rather than what it is. For example, Aristotle considered something alive if it had nutrition and reproduction. According to the modern take, life requires some or all of the following components. 1. Get energy. Metabolism is the ability to extract and use energy from the environment, for example, food, sunlight, or even heat. 2. Survive. Homeostasis is the ability to stay in home-like stability on the inside despite a changing environment on the outside. It usually requires the ability to notice and react to what is happening, to repair damage that has happened, and to surround itself with a barrier to protect it from things happening. 3. Keep surviving. Adaptation is the ability to change over time to keep getting energy even if the environment changes. This is usually the result of gradual changes in the molecules that carry genetic information, but nowadays humans can adapt immediately by changing beliefs and cultural practices. 4. Repeat. Reproduction is the ability to make copies. This is usually the result of copying the molecules that carry genetic information. 5. Die. Death is the ability to no longer be alive, unlike non-living things which will always be non-living. So who gets to join the club of life? If the rules are too strict, not everybody will be allowed to join. If the rules are too relaxed, some non-living things will be allowed to join. For example, crystals feed on minerals, grow, and to some extent evolve. Some self-organizing chemical reactions metabolize energy, compete for resources, adapt to change, and even reproduce. Self-driving cars metabolize fuel and react to stimuli. Forest fires consume, adapt, reproduce, and die. On the other hand, mules, the hybrid offspring of a horse and donkey, are born infertile and cannot reproduce. Is the fire living and the mule not living? That doesn't sound right. According to Stephen Hawking, a living being has only two fundamental parts. 1. Instructions that tell it how to survive and reproduce, and 2. Mechanisms to carry out those instructions. Kind of like software and hardware. All living things, even mules, have both parts. Viruses, however, do not have the necessary machinery to metabolize or reproduce by themselves. While they carry genetic instructions, they must hijack a living cell to make use of them. This converts the cell into a virus-making factory. So viruses are not alive? Not so fast. Parasitic bacteria are considered to be alive even though they cannot survive independently of their host. Indeed, most animals survive by eating living things, and no living thing can survive independently of an external source of energy. All living things are parasites of their environment. The only difference is viruses live off cells, while plants live off sunlight. To blur the line even further, some viruses can bring dead cells back to life. Another reason to consider viruses as life-like and not merely lifeless molecules is their genetic code. The instructions for all biological things on Earth, including viruses, are written in exactly the same language. Since a genetic code is essential to life, and viruses use the same code, perhaps the mechanisms used to carry out the instructions are less important than the code itself. Could we stretch the definition of life even further, beyond viruses to computer viruses? And what about artificial intelligence? Computer viruses consume electricity, some can adapt to spread themselves further, they reproduce by copying their code onto other computers, and many eventually die. Stephen Hawking, who spoke via a computer, thought that computer viruses should count as life. Indeed, he thought that computer viruses were the first form of life that humans have created. Talk about creating life in our own image. Even if you don't agree yet, the artificial intelligence capability of the future may eventually cross that threshold and be considered life. Chemical evolution. But let's leave the definition of life to the linguists. Perhaps what we need more is a theory of how it works. This may help us better understand the process that we call life. Over 100 years ago, a Russian biochemist called Alexander Oparin wrote a book called The Origin of Life, which said that life probably emerged in a gradual progression of increasing complexity. Only one bit in the genetic code has to be changed at a time. An English scientist called Haldane came up with the same idea independently. This theory later became known as chemical evolution. In their expanding search for life on planets beyond our solar system, NASA expanded their concept of life itself. Life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of evolution. Other process-focused theories claim that life is an imperfect replication of informational molecules, or an entity that uses information to harvest energy from and adapt to its environment. Even if we don't consider viruses to be alive, the process that drives their existence appears to be very similar, so don't let definitions limit your understanding. In the wise words of Carl Sagan, man tends to define in terms of the familiar, but the fundamental truths may not be familiar. So what drives this chemical evolution of information-carrying molecules? In the midst of the most deadly war in history, an Austrian published a book entitled What is Life? Erwin Schrödinger, most famous for his hypothetical twin cats, claimed that life is that which resists decaying to disorder. Despite the tendency of everything in the universe to become increasingly disorganized, living systems are always more organized than their environment. This is known as Schrödinger's paradox. The paradox is resolved when it is understood that the law of entropy only applies to closed systems. The internal complexity of a biological system is maintained at the expense of its external environment. The overall consequence, for both organism and surroundings combined, is a loss of energy in order. By definition, life exists at the expense of its environment. The same can be said of viruses. So, are viruses alive? Well, that depends on your definition of life. According to the traditional biological definition, viruses are not alive because they cannot metabolize energy or reproduce by themselves. But not all living parasites can do that either. And viruses and cells are both the result of the same underlying process of chemical evolution. So are viruses really so different from living cells?